Hello, in this video we'll turn our attention to the study of memory. The first thing you should kind of put in mind as you think about this memory material and the modules on memory from the textbook is that there are kind of two complementary models that are being kind of described and used. The first is the older of the two, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, which takes us back to the late 1960s, in which their model consisted of the process of information coming into our memory, first as sensory information, sensory memory, which then goes into short-term memory, and then some of that information actually gets stored into long-term memory. The more contemporary model is more of a cognitive model based on these cognitive principles. This is referred to as the information processing model, and it includes three kind of processes of encoding information, storing it, and then later being able to retrieve it. And the key to the information processing model is that you have to have proper encoding for us to be able to store the information in a format that we can later retrieve or remember. And so if we look at how these two models are related, the encoding process, the way that we transfer information that's coming into us, coming into the system, into something that's going to be in a format that we can store, is basically very similar to what the concept of short-term memory consists of. Short-term memory is sometimes also referred to as working memory because it is where all the work really goes on when we try to figure out how does this new information fit with what I already know, what are the strategies I'm going to use to help me best remember this new information so I can put it into a format and store it in my brain so that I can later use that information either on a test to answer questions or to apply that information out in the real world. So encoding and short-term memory are similar, kind of similar processes, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. In a similar way, storage and retrieval are similar to long-term memory in that we store the information in long-term memory and then later retrieve that information from long-term memory. So these two models complement one another, and even though this is the older of the two models, we use that language. We talk about short-term memory and long-term memory. This is just the more up-to-date way of kind of more contemporary researchers, how they talk about some of those specific strategies in a little bit more detail and in a slightly different way. The first person we should be familiar with who is associated with the study of human memory is Hermann Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus used himself as his research subject, and what he would do is he would practice long lists of nonsense syllables. And one of the things he learned, and this is his learning or retention curve, is that the more times that he practiced the list of nonsense syllables on day one, the fewer times he had to practice on day two to remember all of the nonsense syllables in that list. So the way that it's shown in this graph is that if he practiced the list 64 times on day one, it only took him about 7 or 8 times on day two for him to remember the information or to get them all correct. In contrast, if he only practiced 16 times on day one, it took him far more trials on day two to be able to relearn the information. So it has to do with how much information and repetition and rehearsal, and Ebbinghaus's research was kind of the first demonstrations of some of the strategies that humans could use to improve our memory systems. Another concept you'll run across as you read through the material in our modules is the serial position effect. And this effect has to do with verbal information, lists of words, names, things of that nature, grocery lists, for example, items on your grocery list. And the serial position effect says that the position in the series or in the long list in which the words appear determines which ones we're more or less likely to remember later on. So for example, words at the beginning of the list as well as at the end of the list tend to be remembered more readily than words kind of that get lost in the middle. the words at the beginning of the list is sometimes referred to as the primary or primacy effect, meaning that the first words were probably primed and ready to listen for the information, so those ones tend to kind of stick a little bit more in our memory systems. In contrast, the words at the end of the list also are the most recent ones that we heard before we're asked to repeat the list, so this is often referred to as the recency effect. But both the first words in the list and those at the end are far more likely to be remembered at a later time than those in the middle. And this was some of the early research on memory. And another concept to be familiar with is related to the encoding strategies and how we encode information and the three encoding processes of semantic encoding, auditory, or visual. And what this research demonstrates is that especially when we're working with verbal information, such as textbook information, such as what you're learning for this course, semantic encoding, which means remembering words or associating them with their meaning. So anything that we can do to make new information personally meaningful, such as understanding the meanings of the words or tying that information to something we already understand and know, or how it relates to our own experience and our own lives, are semantic encoding strategies that mean that at a later time would increase the chances that we'll remember that information if we'd encoded the information and stored it in that format with that type of encoding. Acoustic encoding, when we encode information by sounds, oh, the word I'm trying to think of rhymes with something else, is kind of moderately effective, and the least effective is visual, trying to visualize what the word looks like. When we use those kinds of encoding strategies, we tend to not retain the information. It doesn't stick. It's not stored in a format that is easily retrievable at a later time. So the key point to keep in mind when we think about how best to remember information for college classes, for example, is this idea of semantic encoding and trying to make the new information personally meaningful. Another strategy, and this is another encoding strategy that you'll run across when you read the modules on encoding and memory enhancement, is chunking. Chunking means organizing information into smaller units that have meaning. And so, for example, if we have a series of letters, just random letters, that's harder to remember, just random letters, than if we form words out of those letters. Words are easier, they're meaningful, and so that's an example of chunking where we're able to remember large amounts of information when it's organized in different ways. So for example, 3 and 4, the question would be, which of these two sentences or lists of letters would you be most likely to remember? 3 is going to be challenging because the order of the letters are not in meaningful units. In contrast, 4 is more likely to be remembered and retrieved because the words nickels, 7, any, in, stitch, don't are meaningful units. It's still not very sensical, and that's demonstrated down here below. It's harder to remember the phrase nickels, 7, any, in, stitch, don't than it is down here to reorder those words into a sentence or a phrase such as don't take any wooden nickels. So it's the transferring information into something more meaningful is this chunking phenomenon. We do it with acronyms so we can remember kind of a long list or things if we make, using the first letter of each word in an acronym. And you may have used some of these learning strategies to remember the order of colors in the rainbow and things like that. The part of your brain that seems to underlie the ability to form short-term memories as well as to retrieve long-term memories is your hippocampus. And when you do one of the homework assignments related to the memory material, you'll learn about a disease called Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's is a disease of the hippocampus, and specifically the large concentration of neurons in the hippocampus that manufacture and secrete acetylcholine are the neurons that are being destroyed and not working properly, which creates then the memory problems and the increased cognitive deterioration that we associate with Alzheimer's disease. One last concept that we'll talk about here, or one of the close to the end of concepts, is the study of the effects of context on memory. And context are these memory cues, but the context can be a variety of different things. So for example, one example from your textbook is that there's been some research that has shown that words heard underwater are best recalled when you are once again underwater. Words heard on land are best recalled on land. So that would be the context, either being underwater or being on land, can serve as a cue to remind you of information that you learned the last time you were underwater or on land, for example. I've added another kind of aspect and a different kind of research related to this. Even mood states have been found to affect memories. For example, when people are feeling depressed, those feelings of depression many times will trigger memories of negative experiences, and that seems to kind of feed into our depression at that time. Similarly, if we're feeling very happy, our memories tend to take on a more positive, kind of tone, and we're more likely to remember more happy things and probably less likely to think about the negative. There's also been some research that suggests that drinking, intoxication, for example, can once again trigger memories of something we did when we were drinking the last time. One example might be if in a last drinking bout you hid an object, maybe a drinking bottle or your car keys or something. When you get drunk again, that mood state, that physiological state of intoxication, may serve as a memory cue to help you remember where your car keys are or possibly where you hid that bottle. So there's been a lot of interesting research on human memory, and we're just kind of looking at a very few items here. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this idea of forgetting as encoding failure. Information that was not properly encoded is really not likely to ever be properly stored, and so one of the theories of forgetting is that you really never properly encoded it in the first place. So we cannot remember what we have not encoded. So there are a lot of interesting and helpful suggestions in your modules on memory that can help you to improve your own memory. And I've also provided a link here to some work by a memory researcher, Dan Schachter, who has written a book titled The 7 Sins of Memory. I will click on this and open that hyperlink to show you, but it will take you out to the website, kind of hard to see here. It's the website for the American Psychological Association, which overviews Schachter's 7 Sins of Memory, beginning with transient, and then you'll find some more information there. So if you're interested, feel free to go back and take a look at Schachter's work as well. That ends our mini lecture on human memory, and come back next time where we will be talking about human intelligence.